Welcome to Moral Side of the News, our weekly discussion of today's top stories from a moral, ethical, and religious point of view. I'm Shawn Kaelin with the WHAS Crusade for Children, and I'm joined today, as always, by a distinguished panel of local religious leaders. Reverend Dr. George Wasson, Faithpoint Church; Father Joe Graffis, Archdiocese of Louisville; Reverend Sally McClain, Christian Church Disciples of Christ; Rabbi Stan Miles, Louisville Melton School; and Richard Uhler, retired U.S. Army chaplain. We begin this week with Israel launching what it calls preemptive strikes on the nuclear and military targets in Iran.
Overnight, Israel launching Operation Rising Lion, several waves of preemptive strikes against Iran aimed at crippling its nuclear program. Video circulating online showing explosions lighting up the night sky in Tehran. Multiple waves hitting not just Iran's nuclear sites, but targeting military leadership and their top scientists, taking aim at the Iranian regime. Israel saying Iran had enough material to produce up to 15 nuclear bombs within days. The operation, a joint effort between the IDF and Mossad, seen as a dramatic escalation and a bigger, more targeted plan than many expected. Several residential buildings on fire in Iran's capital. Iran confirming overnight at least 2 of their military leaders were killed, including the commander of the Revolutionary Guard, and several nuclear scientists also reportedly killed in the strikes. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu saying Israel had no choice but to act, calling Iran's nuclear program, quote, a clear and present danger.
This operation will continue for as many days as it takes to remove this threat.
Iran launching more than 100 drones towards Israel, the IDF saying it has intercepted those drones before reaching Israeli airspace. Israel's defense minister declaring a state of emergency, calling up tens of thousands of troops. Concerns now that the operation overnight could increase chances of all-out war between the countries and expand into a regional conflict.
So panel, that story was from a week ago Friday as we tape on Friday. We're going to break this up into 2 parts. We'll talk about the U.S. response in a second here. But first, your initial thoughts on this development with Israel preemptively striking Iran.
Since the winter of 1979, when the Shah was deposed, the existential threat to Israel was self-evident because the leadership of Iran from 1979 to this day has said over and over and over again, we are going to destroy Israel. We are going to kill all the Jews in Israel. Oh, and just constant. And with the development of nuclear capability, this becomes an existential threat. And so I'm against war, I'm against loss of life, but I'm also against bullies. And I'm against people saying, I am going to kill you over and over and over again. And then using other proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, to make it happen. I pray that this situation will be dealt with and that Iran's nuclear capabilities will become non-existent. And I pray also that the Iranian people, that the loss of life of the Iranian people is negligible at best. Because they're the innocents in this situation. They don't deserve this either.
You know, I'm reminded of a passage in Romans that says, as much as it depends upon you, seek to live in peace with one another. And just the reality of our world is that no matter how hard we might try to seek to live at peace with others, and we try that, it's to no avail. I mean, it's interesting when you look at the Islamic world there, even the surrounding Islamic Muslim countries surrounding Iran are even allowing Israel to use their airspace, because what's the perception of what's really going on in Iran, right?
I mean, I think this is, for moral people, all war is a messy thing.
Yeah.
You can have ideals, and as from a Catholic tradition, we used to have a just war theory going back to St. Augustine. Most of people question that now, whether in the circumstances we are today, with all the different kinds of weapons that we have, whether that can ever apply. And war should always be a last result. Yet on the other hand, sometimes you got to do it in self-defense. And certainly the challenge that, and how can we minimize civilian deaths and all of this kind of stuff? I mean, that's what bothers me about Gaza and all those kind of situations as well. And how do we do that? Unfortunately, when you get into it, there is casualties beyond that. So it's a real dilemma. I just don't think we could expand it. Obviously, Israel seems to have air superiority. I would think that would certainly bring Iran to say, we don't need to continue this, let's negotiate. And we'll get into the other question when we get there.
I have wondered if there's ever going to be any peace in the Middle East, ever. Yes. And is anyone ever going to solve what the conflict is, because it gets more and more and more complicated. You can go back to boundaries and respecting boundaries, but that's very, very difficult to do. To me, this just is an ever-increasing dilemma, and is it going to take the whole world to solve it, or are they going to be able to solve it themselves? I don't know.
I mean, I think an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, which is one of the Old Testament things. I'm not sure every rabbi agrees with that, but sometimes, as from the Christian perspective, love your enemies. How do we balance all of that?
Joe, the rabbis looked at that verse and were troubled by it.
Okay.
So the rabbis decided that it means something other than the literal statement. Okay. What it means are compensatory damages, not more than one eye for one eye, not more than one tooth for one tooth. In other words, it's not if you take out my eye, then I can cut off your head. So that
interesting.
That's.
I've never heard that.
Well, it was bringing justice, right? Because in the ancient world, it wasn't really characterized by an equality of justice. And so if I would, for instance, steal one of your cows, then you really could do anything to me. And so the ancient law really sought to, I'm not sure what the word you said was in there, but equalize, so to speak. Compensatory damages that you don't get to kill somebody if they take your cow, but you have to figure out a way that we bring justice back into our world, right?
Yeah. You're the military man, or chaplain here.
Yeah, and one place in the New Testament says, strive for the peace of all mankind. And then we read elsewhere where it says, in the last days, perilous times shall come. And we're seeing a growing, what we say with how things are going in the world today. They're getting worse and worse. Are we getting towards the end times or not? Some say yes, some say no.
You also have an increase in population, and you have an increase in communication, which makes everything global now instead of local. I think that adds to the mix as well.
Which adds to immigration and all that kind of stuff, another whole issue.
And I read in a world politics textbook back in the 70s that between the end of World War II and the end of the Vietnam conflict, there was at least 240 plus wars going on, or skirmishes, or something. Many more today. I don't know if we've ever had a time where there hasn't been some sort of a war of some kind.
But isn't it interesting how we have to try to figure out how to not let that, in a sense, anesthetize us? That technology has made it such that we do have we know exactly what's happening. We can look at our watches and say, in Israel, it's X time, and we can get on and see exactly what's happening over there right now, or we can see war played out on the screen, but we're sitting here on our comfortable seats and, just watching it, and are we entering into what that pain is and what that difficulty is and what that challenge is? I mean, oh my goodness, it just makes it a little too easy, maybe. So, sometimes I think the armchair quarterbacking kind of thing of trying to figure it out is that it just makes it anesthetized for me. And I don't really want it to be that. I want us to say, wow, like, this is not good, right? War is not good in any way.
And how much the more so nuclear war.
Oh.
Before the program, I asked my colleagues, I said, the wind does blow from west to east, right? And they said, yes, it does. If, God forbid, the Israelis, the Iranians would do a nuclear strike against the land and the people of Israel, there would be that nuclear strike. But also with the nuclear strike, there would be nuclear fallout, consequences. And so as the wind blows, the Israelis would certainly get harmed, but the people of Iran would be immediately next with the consequences of the fallout. And we can't.
Egypt as well.
Yeah.
So, and all across North Africa. I mean, I think, as Pope Francis said a couple of years ago, are we, as you said, on the stage of World War III, not as we saw World War II or World War I, but this combination of all the unsettled parts of the world, whether it's Asia, Africa, in our own country, Central America, all over the place, that we can all get drawn into hatred of one another. And I mean, I think that's kind of the root of all of this, and how can we overcome that hate? I think that's where our religions of all sorts need to come in.
And from a perspective of military, we have to certainly minimize collateral damage. And I got to Vietnam a year after the My Lai incident, so we were certainly cautioned when we first got there. Be careful who you're pointing at your weapon at,
right?
Because people did look pretty much the same, and they were experiencing the same thing too. And in the Gulf War situation, where people looked the same. How do you know? How do you distinguish? They didn't have uniforms. And the way it was in Vietnam, if you were dealing with the Viet Cong, you couldn't tell the difference between them and a logger, or they were loggers by day, VC by night. It was those kinds of things we had to be careful of. But the difference between the combatants here is Israel is certainly concerned about that, and they want to make sure that they don't do that type of collateral damage, whereas Iranians, they don't care.
Let's move on to the second topic of this, and George, you mentioned it, and Sally, peace in the Middle East. It's interesting that no other Middle Eastern countries have come to the defense of Iran in this. They're just standing by. Right. 10 years ago, that wouldn't have been the case. Israel did this 10 years ago. So maybe we are closer to peace in an interesting kind of way. But should the U.S. get involved in this? That's been the biggest discussion this week. And so let's take a look now from an ABC News story this morning about the latest on that.
This morning, as Israel and Iran trade fierce blows, and after weighing his options over several tense days, President Trump is now giving himself 2 weeks to decide whether the U.S. should strike Iran. The president holding out hope for negotiations as European leaders meet in Geneva today with the Iranians to try and jumpstart talks. I asked the press secretary, if there's no progress in the next 2 weeks, does that mean the U.S. will bomb Iran?
Is he saying that if
Iran does not come back to the negotiating table within the next 2 weeks, that the president will strike?
The president is saying that he will make a decision whether or not to go within the next 2 weeks. It's very clear and direct.
Is he seeing any inklings of progress that give him that hope that talks are still possible?
Well, that's why he said in the statement that I just read for all of you, based on the fact that there's a substantial chance of negotiations that may or may not take place with Iran in the near future, he will make that decision within the next 2 weeks.
But the pressure to make up his mind only growing. According to a source, the president is troubled by the deep divisions in his own party about what he should do, hold out for negotiations or join the attack. The president's new 2-week timeline, a blow to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who has been pushing for the U.S. to get involved. Only the U.S. has the 30,000-pound bunker buster bomb capable of penetrating Iran's nuclear site 300 feet underground. Netanyahu now publicly putting his trust in Trump to make what he says is the right choice.
So the question to the panel, should the U.S. get involved?
I think it really gets messy. And for us and for all of our allies, obviously we have equipment and some weapons that Israel doesn't have that could be perhaps, quote, helpful in this. But I think we need to keep our hands off as much as possible because, you know, as you've already said, we're in negotiations with many other Arab countries, and there seems to be some progress in that area, praise God. And that could destroy many of those relationships. So I think we need to be very, very cautious.
I don't want to see any American lives lost. Any of our service personnel, their lives lost. Equipment is another matter. I'm sure that the Israelis are quite capable of using any equipment that if the United States would either sell or loan or give to them to end the nuclear threat. But I don't want to see any of our service personnel lose their lives in this conflict.
You were talking about how we sit here very comfortably, you know, discussing this. And from 2003 till 2012, our 2 oldest children had 12 deployments between the 2 of them. So from a family perspective, and you also know because you were in war, there's a lot more to it that only 1% of the American people know anything about. You know, I was the only person for some people that knew anybody that had a soldier that was deployed. And I will tell you, it is a night and a day of total angst when you have a soldier and you have no idea what's going on because you can't know. You might be able to, we could Zoom at that point, but there's so much you don't know, so much dread that it's just inconceivable that unless you're there, you don't know about it.
Shelley, I think that's such a great point because, again, the term armchair quarterbacking for me just kind of jumps in there. That there is so much that we don't know. I mean, we know what we don't want, right? Like we don't want to enter war. We don't want to have American lives lost. We want to find where that tension is between an isolationist as well as being a working in our world and not getting drawn into everybody's conflict kind of thing. And it's hard. As I watch something like that, the very first thing that comes to my mind is I thank God I'm not the one who has to make that decision. But what that does for me as a Christian is it drives me to my knees to pray for the president and for his advisors and for the folks that, dear God, help them to make the best decision.
Congress. Right? Won't we have to have approval from Congress? Or do we act first and get approval later?
That's a tricky question.
Oh, I need the answer to that question.
To declare war, you'd have Congress, but President has the power to move troops.
So he could order a strike with this huge bomb without the approval of Congress.
Right.
Is what you're saying.
But then there would be implications after that.
And then, so that's not a declaration of war.
I think one of the key phrases you hear often is clear and present danger. And if Iran poses a clear and present danger to an ally of the United States or the United States, I think the president has it within his power to take action.
And I think, are you finished? I think one of the things you brought up, I heard the phrase that Donald Rumsfeld used, the known unknowns, that we don't know about this, and what are the implications that come afterwards? What would, if we got in, what would Iran do for us, blocking harbors, going after some of our troops nearby? We don't know a lot of those questions and all that kind of stuff. And those all things have to be weighed. You can't just think in the moment. Moral dilemmas are messy.
That's part of the operational planning.
Right.
And the operational planning, there are several phases of that. And part of it is the intelligence gathering and a few of those things in preparation. Also moving equipment into place, those kinds of things. But you do your planning from what do you want as your objective? And that's the end result, end state. And then from there, you backward plan to get to that point.
But what they want to do is take out that bomb that's buried so deep.
So that's
or
their
the
objective.
potential of that bomb that's buried so deep. Because we had the potential in Iran, and we saw what happened there. Because apparently there was not immediate potential.
And we don't know whether they've moved or whatnot. Unfortunately, I think, Stan, whatever this bomb is, the bunker busting bomb, as they call it, I would think you would need our Air Force to carry out that rather than pass it on to a Jewish Air Force or the Israeli Air Force, which gets us in the middle of all of this kind of stuff. It's I think your answer of prayer is rule number one for all of us. And I worry about, as you said, all the people we've fired a lot of intelligence people who have all kinds of experience over the last couple of years. And where is that advice coming? And that's another fear.
It worries me by the president saying 2 weeks. I fear that he's tipping his hand somewhat. And that, I don't, there may be logic there. I don't know. But if there is, it eludes me. I just don't know why specifically saying in 2 weeks we will decide.
Well, they've said 2 weeks several times about several other issues, and it never happened. So.
Yeah, go ahead.
But I've heard that it's only a stealth that can take out and carry that particular bomb, and it has to be American pilots that do it. So there's the answer to that question. We have to be involved if that's going to happen.
Yeah, it always seems interesting. I agree with you of giving those time frames. I'm like, okay, you're going to tell the enemy that you're showing up in 2 weeks, or what are they going to move and what are they going to do? But to go along with, I think, some of the idea, and again, I'm not the president, so I'm not really privy to all that, but I know as a dad, if I tell my kids, okay, you need to do something, and you have until X time to do it, if I don't do anything about that, it's just going to go by, right? And so I don't know
your credibility.
It does. So I don't know if he's playing the high, hard game, right? So, because we've seen him do that already, right? You have 60 days. 61, something's going to happen. And maybe he's banking on some of that kind of change in his pocket, so to speak, right? Of saying, I told you. I said 2 weeks. And so I don't know. It's a tough one to call, isn't it?
The moral ethical dilemma would be, and I wrote some questions down just so I could remember them when I was thinking about it. And you mentioned too, it's since 1979, Iran has been saying, death to Israel and death to America. So is that a justifiable reason?
Well.
Is that a justifiable reason for involvement? Is the first thing, and the second would be. Or do we wait for the consequence of perhaps nuclear deployment due to inaction? Those are the questions I thought of when I was doing that thought pattern this morning.
Many questions, few answers.
But hope, because whenever we talk about can this situation be solved, my thoughts go back to the history of Ireland, with Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. That conflict that began, I believe, in the 18th century, was solved. There is peace there. If there can be peace there, there can be peace in the Middle East.
And I want to draw us back again to what I said, and you mentioned it as well, the whole prayer issue, right? That as people of faith, we believe that God, one of my little slogans that I say often is, God does stuff when we pray, right? Now, we don't always get the answers we want. There's a lot we don't understand, but wow, that should not negate us being in serious prayer, asking God to do something miraculous, something supernatural here, even to intervene. I don't know. This is a tough one.
I mean, you were talking about Vietnam. This is the 50th anniversary of the end of that war, and I happened to be in Vietnam a couple of years ago for 10 days with some of our young priests who are from Vietnam, and all of us were guys whose parents were in World War II and all that kind of stuff. So we were like, oh, they're going to be us Americans. We were welcomed everywhere we went, you know, at least by most of the people there. And I remember one gentleman, an older gentleman my age, said, we consider you Americans our friends. You didn't win the war. We didn't win it either. We're scared of China, but you're our friends. And I thought, 50 years later, in that country,
would we hear the same things from the
us
Iranians?
Yeah.
The media didn't do us any favors.
Right.
And that's the reason why we came home to a lot of agitation.
Oh, yeah, horrible. Unconscionable.
Sad time.
I don't know if we have enough time to get into the crusade portion of our next conversation, but Crusade 72 just wrapped up. Many of you are on the advisory panel that get to distribute the funds. We ended up higher than we wanted to, so we have about a minute left.
Barely.
No, we want to go higher than that.
You want to go higher? Right.
You can still give.
Yeah.
You can still give, but talk to us briefly. Father Joe, you are the chairman of the advisory council. What it means to be able to give out more than what
we
you
were
thought.
sweating that night, Jason Cosby and I were, because we had, our target was roughly between 5.5, 5.7 for the panel, the advisory panel to come up with, but the need was so great out there that we set aside about 5.82. And then as the total kept, are we going to have to reduce our numbers? And we ended up, our number was $12,000 less than what we got, so we got to put some extra money in a couple of different areas that certainly needed it. But thanks again to the firefighters who do an incredible job, and even some of our other counties. We were excited about Fayette County has increased and all that kind of stuff.
So thank you very much. Sorry, I got to cut you off there. Sally and Stan and George are coming on to the panel, so it'll be a fun experience for you next year. Richard's not on the advisory panel yet.
I'm going to get on the block.
We'll break him in.
Yeah,
quickly.
break him in. And he was on some grant hearings this year, next year, the full process. So anyway, thanks to our panel today. Reverend Dr. George Wasson, Faithpoint Church, Father Joe Graffis, Archdiocese of Louisville, Reverend Sally McClain, Christian Church Disciples of Christ, Rabbi Stan Miles, the Louisville Melton School, and Richard Uhler, retired U.S. Army chaplain. Thanks for watching Moral Side of the News this week. Join us next week for an all-new Moral Side of the News.